Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pi, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Forbes has labelled Matt Strain as the AI whisperer. But what connects him to the world is not the technology he uses, but the people he keeps closest to him. Matt is a man of great ambition, also willing to leave comfort in search of something new. His departure from prestigious roles at Apple and Adobe should be proof enough of that. For leaders trying to find the balance between the safe play and the ambitious one, between embracing technology and prioritising humanity, Matt Strain gives us the perfect roadmap. Delighted to have you on Pivot Points today, Matt, and welcome. I've never talked to an AI whisperer before. I think it was Forbes that called you an AI whisperer. So I'm fascinated to understand what an AI whisperer is. But before we get into that, could you just, for the benefit of our guests, introduce yourself?
Yeah. Well, Dave, it's great to be here. And thank you. So I speak very softly, I think is why they said that for the whisperer part. Anyway, so my career has been mostly all in tech. So, I mean, one of the things, even though I've been in tech, I don't come from a tech background. I was actually a political science major in college. And then from there, was really interested in sort of the intersection of where technology was going and how it affected people. And also from the political science standpoint, I really was interested in looking across different cultures. So right after college, I went out to Asia, and shortly after getting to Asia, I ended up working for Apple. And that was sort of the first part of my career. And when you're talking about pivotal points and things, one of the early stages, the things that happened to me there was I ended up managing a good chunk of the business for Apple in Southeast Asia. And it was there that I started seeing the impact that technology could have on people and on companies. And that really interested me. So I started my career with Apple for about 10 years in Asia, came back just as the search industry was starting. And I worked for Alta Vista for a couple of years. So picked the wrong search company, but learned a lot about the industry. Went from there and then started looking at the data world. And I worked with some companies that did analysis for customer loyalty and large data sets for some of the big brands. That took me to an interest in digital marketing. So I then went to Adobe and ran and set up their digital marketing for the creative business. And that ended up being brand and demand marketing. That then I saw what was starting to happen with AI and predictive marketing, and ended up working with the AI team and leading the innovation pipeline and strategy for the research lab at Adobe. And then a couple of years ago, that transitioned into leaving the corporate world after 17 years, setting up my own company that is now focused on AI for executives and leadership. But there were a couple twists and turns along the way, leaving Adobe, things that I tried, things that didn't work, and to got me to where I am now, which I'm having more fun with and more enjoyment than I have ever had in my, professional career.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. So if we go back to those early days, what made you go to Asia? That is a big pivot to come straight out of university in the States or college in the States and get off and go to Asia. And you went there to live.
Yeah, well, I first went there for, the full story was I went to Japan for a little bit. I came back, then went back and I ended up in Hong Kong. And there were a series of decisions that got me there. But it was really, I grew up in DC, obviously grew up in the States, going to school in New England, which is a fairly parochial area. I went to a, small Jesuit college, which I really enjoyed, but it felt very small to me. So my reaction to that was wanting to do something international, which I'd always been interested in. And I had one professor when I was looking at a corporate program in New York City to go down for an international training program, he just said, Matthew, he goes, go, just get out and go. So he encouraged me to leave and just go and try something. So one thing led to another. I got a scholarship to go to Hong Kong. That then led me to connecting with Apple when I was there. And what was going to be 9 months turned into about 9 years. And just a series really of kind of just being open and saying yes to things that weren't 100% defined, but were sort of directionally of where I thought I wanted to go and was willing to take a bet on it. So a lot of it was just, like a young American kid who wanted to get out and explore and try something new and try something different.
And I mean, Apple, everybody goes, that's the to die for place to work. But I would imagine actually being at Apple for 9 years and out in Asia, you've probably got some great stories to tell.
Yeah. So, yes. And, those were not the great days of Apple. right?
No,
Those are
no.
the early days where we had small market share, and a lot of the options we had were underwater and expired, which is criminal based on where things are today. But what was nice, one being, and I got kind of lucky with this, but being young and American in a part of in a region where Apple wasn't focused on, allowed us to do things where we were off the radar of corporate. We could go and experiment. We hit our numbers every quarter while the rest of the company was struggling. We had some incredible growth markets that we jumped into, right? China and India were just taking off. So here I was at 23 or 24, country manager for India. And because basically what happened was there was a meeting and they're like, we got somebody, the corporate just said we have to look after Southeast Asia. Who wants to do it? And everybody else is like, don't want anything. There was no computer market there at the time, really. And I raised my hand and I ended up walking out of that meeting with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and the Maldives and Thailand as my territory, which I just loved, right? Because it was a huge adventure. And India had crazy high or import duties at that time. So there were all kinds of creative ways to try to get around that. I'd worked a little bit as an intern in the government affairs group, so I had access to some of the top brass back in the States. So we ended up creating a whole push to move India from manufacturing to a software industry. I had a chance to work with people that I had no right to be talking to, like the Ratan Tatas and Asim Premjis, who started Wipro. So was actually able to kind of be part of that whole growth of what was happening in India. The other thing that was fascinating that never shows up on any of the stories about Apple is because the import duties were so high, and we had people who were literally hiding their Macs in trucks from Nepal, taking them overland, covering them with vegetables so they wouldn't be detected, so they could sell them in the country. But we ended up finding the guy who was running Digital Computer back in the day had some excess capacity on their line in Bangalore when Bangalore was just starting off. So we actually shipped a container of components into Bangalore, manufactured the Mac LC2s to get around import duties, which, if one of your questions is what is the biggest mistake you've ever made, trying to assemble a container of parts in Bangalore for the first time. It did what it was supposed to do, but let's just say it was a very important learning for me early on. So there were things like that that, would never have happened had I gone the traditional path in the States and got me access to people and places that, were just out of sync with where I typically would have had at that stage of my career.
Yeah. I mean, what did you learn about culture at Apple? Was it a strong culture? Because you get the impression, I'm an Apple fan. I got my first Apple Mac in like 1984 when those tower units came out with the cathode ray tubes, and I've been a fan ever since. But you get the impression from outside that the culture of Apple is really strong, really clear. I've not met many people who've actually sort of worked at Apple for a period of time, particularly in those early days when it was really trying to find itself. What was it like, the culture working with Steve? Was Steve Jobs presumably was at the helm for most of that period, or was he?
No. Steve was out for a lot of that period. So I was there for part of that kind of funky in between where there were still a lot of people who had been with Steve, and then Steve came back in.
Yeah.
So what was nice is, I mean, it was interesting, right? Because the culture with Steve is, a lot of it is Steve's vision that is implemented, and the people on his team are very clear, and they'll implement it in many cases silos because everybody knows what they need to do. In our case, we were based out of Asia, so we had a fair amount of autonomy. So we still had that kind of that Apple spirit of truly like the power to be your best and, think different was infused throughout what we did. So a lot of us, at a very young age had a tremendous amount of leeway on what we wanted to do. So it was really a culture of empowerment and free latitude to do what you needed to do to kind of, to develop these markets and explore these markets. Some super smart people. One of the other things with that was, culturally, Apple made a decision early on to get into the local languages, which it was one of the things that allowed us to go internationally as strong as we did because we had some tremendous local language support. So in India, for example, we were selling into the government and the newspapers because we could support 13 different languages, and all the typography. We had,
Wow.
I think at one point when I was doing Bangladesh, we had the highest market share probably of anywhere in the world of about 55%. Now, it wasn't a lot, but it was, percentage wise, it was a good market share, but it's because we could do, all the local languages that were required. So there were things like that were interesting that also just gave us, some really great inroads to all kinds of different companies and people.
Mm. Why would you move away from Apple? That's a big meaty decision, I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, it was coming up on 10 years for me in Asia, which seemed like a good, my parents were getting a little bit older. The internet was starting to kick in. So I left there I came back in 96. So this was early. So I wanted to come back to the or to the Bay Area. So I had a job that had me half time here for the last part and half time in Asia. And then I saw what was happening with Apple. I took 6 months off to kind of figure out what I wanted to do and then left Apple and then just started working with some of the internet companies and doing some consulting here in the Bay Area. And
Yeah.
also it felt like it was time for a different chapter, right? I mean, I learned a lot. I loved the company. The company was still at that point going through a lot of change. And it just felt like it was time to try something new and, jump into what was happening with the internet.
Yeah. And so did you just join the startup revolution?
Yeah, in San Francisco, in South Park, all the craziness of trying to figure out what to do and how to raise money and, how to grow a team. So learned a huge amount, fair amount of drama. Most of the companies I was associated with did okay. None were a huge hit, as was the case for most of us working in and around South Park at the time. But it was, part of it then was just an affirmation of the importance of working with good people, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the people and, as sort of the culture that you build around it. So I had a couple great examples of people to work with, some examples of people not to work with. Learned about sort of the risk of somebody getting enamored with an idea where you're sort of disconnected from the customer. And that was sort of my first exposure to that facet of business.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of really good learning. And then one of the companies I joined was more of a consulting company, again, with some super smart young people who were looking at how we can use data to help big companies make better decisions in that whole customer loyalty space. And that's where I got enamored with the world of data, which has always been fascinating. For me, it was reading Moneyball, the Michael Lewis book back in the day. That was kind of
Yeah.
an eye opener. I've probably given that book to 10 or 15 different people, just in terms of how we can use data to kind of think about problems and inform problems differently, which is also, now why AI is just so fascinating to me. So that was kind of a learning through that middle period there. My time at Alta Vista was just fascinating because, we tend to look back at Google, but there was, Alta Vista and InfoSeek and Excite, and there were probably 15 different, search companies at that time that were formulating and bubbling all kinds of different ways that they were surfacing their results. And Google came out ahead, but there was a lot of great technology that was developed. But much like now, a lot of those companies, fell by the wayside. So, we're sort of seeing that same thing happen now with, a lot of the AI companies that are coming up and trying things. And, a few will make it, but many won't. But that technology will resurface in different ways.
Yeah. 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 And then what was the sort of main learnings you would go from that? Would I call it a more of an entrepreneurial phase where you were really experimenting? And if you were a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old today, what would be your advice to yourself in that? Because we're almost going through the same phase again, as you say, with AI, where people are coming up with ideas, trying to deploy it. It's going out of date in 6 months, the business. So that experimentation phase is happening big time again. And I remember that well with .com and how everybody jumped on the bandwagon, and then very, very few actually made it to become a business as opposed to an idea with some funding.
I think the main takeaway from me is, to hang on to the people you meet along the way, because at the time it feels like whether you're raising money or you're working with a team, yes, you're focused on making the company successful, but it's really those people that are going to support you further on in the career or are going to be the person who you call when you need to see something else. I mean, I can say with the Apple network that I worked on, or worked with, I can pick up a phone and call any of those people and we'll do anything for each other. So part of that was also in your early 20s, but I think as you go through the career, it's those people that you meet and that you form a relationship with that you may not know what the business transaction is going to be at the time, but if it's somebody who you connect to, you can either call them as a mentor or they'll call you or your kids will want to call them. So if I was doing it all again, I would spend more time focusing on developing and adding value to that network, which is also the thing I learned, both at Apple and when I was at Adobe for a long time, is you get so insular at a big company. A lot of that is really inward looking, but to
Yeah.
make sure that you are building those relationships outside, because those are the people that, particularly if you go through a hard time together, you can pick up the phone and call 30 years later and just pick up and start going again.
And do you think in the modern sort of soundbite age, young people think about relationships in the same way? Because I talk to my own team an awful lot about relationships. My own business is a relationship business, basically. And so those relationships are absolutely key. And if you do a piece of work, you make 20 new relationships. How you keep those alive, how you talk to those people over the next 10 years can define your future success or not. If you let them wither and die, and a lot of consultants let those relationships wither and die, and I've never understood it. But, it's interesting to hear a real technology leader talking about relationships in the way I would talk about relationships and how important they are to building your career. How do you go about maintaining those relationships over time? Is it simply through, staying in touch 5 times a year, or do you have any processes for maintaining relationships and building that web?
Nothing systematic, right?
Yeah.
I tend to like people, and maybe it's like some deep insecurity. I just feel like I need to stay connected with people. But like I love social media for that, right? Particularly when we've all lived in different places, a way to stay in touch. So simple things from just, actually one of the geeky things that I do is I like photography, and I have a huge set of photos of people that I've known over the last 40 years. Largely for incriminating functionality if I need to. So it gives me some built-in security. But just to have some fun with that, right? Like a good friend of mine was one of the senior most marketing people at Apple, and we traveled together with his family in some crazy places in India. He was his family was from India, and every couple of years I'll just drop him a photo and say, "Do you remember this time?" Right?
Yeah.
So it's like they're little things like that stay top of mind. I even think like Facebook and LinkedIn, as sort of as off they've become in some ways. I see people who will comment on something that I've done that I haven't seen in 25 years. So at least there's that connection. And
Yeah.
particularly like with the LinkedIn world, where you just never know who's reading your stuff, people have reached out and said, "Oh, that was great." And just a light connection like that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing now that in the AI space, because I do have the luxury of spending all day thinking about AI and kind of have a vantage point that some others don't, just dropping a quick article or a quick line to say, here's something that might be of interest to you. Or, when people come through town, the next step is just getting together with them and something like that. But the funniest thing, which I haven't done yet, which I want to do, is when I was at Adobe, there were 2 of us that ran these 2 different groups. I ran the marketing and she ran the business side. And we used to have these groups with about 35 people. And for some reason, one of them, despite all my changes, still shows up on my Outlook calendar. So I have a list of all 35 people that were in this meeting. I think after 15 years, we should come back and reconvene on Zoom, all like 35 of those people, and just see what we're up to. But
That'd be very cool.
I think we all take ourselves too seriously. I think for young people, the thing that I've tried to teach my kids and myself is no matter who you are, right? If somebody says, "Dave, that was a great presentation," and puts a little thought into a note that they send you, right? Or just a way to stay in touch, or like the podcast, right? Anybody who does a podcast knows how much work it is. And most people will listen to it and appreciate it, but probably not send that person a note, right? So just a quick note that says, "Hey, Dave, really enjoyed that podcast with so-and-so, great work," right?
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that somebody remembers, whether you're like one of the top professors or one of the top business people. And the worst case is the email never makes it to them, and it's really no loss, and it took, a couple minutes of your time. So I think that's the kind of thing that I have found helpful. And then when you do need something, you're not coming into somebody cold, and you can just ask somebody genuinely, what advice would you have for me?
Yeah. No, that simple technique of acknowledgement or a note of thanks, it often triggers a lovely reply back, and everybody loves it, and yet very few people use it.
Well, I think there's sort of I don't know, maybe it's also for, for men too, in the culture we've been raised, like reaching out and acknowledging that just isn't something that we're really trained to do.
Yeah.
But, or it may just be me that like if I do a talk somewhere, a handful of people might say something. But,
Yeah.
it means a lot every time somebody takes just a little bit of time to do it. And I think there's an assumption that either people at a certain level or a certain seniority, get that all the time and they don't need it. But, I guarantee that if you're a CEO rolling out a new program to your team, and at whatever level, somebody just sends a nice note, you're going to remember that person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I say that not from a manipulative way, but like from a genuine way of just
Yeah.
reaching out. And in a world where we're online and on Zoom all the time, and AI is so infused, I think that human connection is really more important than ever.
I don't know about you, but it was drummed into me as a young child that you always say thank you. And, thank you notes, be it a kid's party or whatever, you get into that rhythm and you just automatically say thank you. And it's such a big deal. And yet these days people just forget, I think, how, and just take it for granted. So your next pivot in terms of Adobe, did you join Adobe when Adobe was taking off, or what was it, the megacorp that it is today?
So I joined Adobe right after Adobe acquired Macromedia.
There's a name, Macromedia. I'd forgotten that
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. So, and I went in, I said, this is either going to be a huge success or it's going to be a colossal flop. Either way, I want to be part of it. And I learned a lot about how to integrate companies because Adobe did a really nice job with that. And subsequently, they were very, very well thought out in how they acquired and integrated companies. So I learned a lot from that. Yeah, so that's when I joined, and we were, search was just starting as a marketing channel. Digital marketing was just starting.
Yeah.
So when I joined, I think the company was doing something like, $1,000 a year in paid search. And I got to join Google's early tech council and be sort of one of the, they had like, I think 10 or 15 companies that were on their tech council, which was just a really fascinating time, right? Data-driven marketing was taking off. So we had huge amount of credibility. We were doing work around lifetime value and when to market people in when to market and how to market based on, some deep segmentation. So working with some great data scientists. So learned a huge amount about that world, by hands-on, had a chance to work with a number of great agencies, which was one of the real benefits of a company like Adobe is, we had great affinity with the creative market and budgets that gave us the luxury of working with some great agencies.
Yeah. Amazing. And that sort of period at Adobe, when you're talking about integrating businesses, a lot of companies find, they do the acquisition, they find it very difficult to integrate. What was it about Adobe that made it good at that? Because that's a valuable life lesson.
I mean, the thing Adobe did really well is they were very well thought out in how they went about doing these things. So, they had a plan. They thought very hard about how to integrate, where the companies were, where the people were, how to bring them together, how to make everybody feel good. Having said that, the Macromedia culture was really different, right? It was younger, more aggressive, more just innovative. Whereas, Adobe had been around for a while, right? I mean, the PDF Photoshop culture was a established professional level culture that didn't have quite the excitement. So there's definitely some integration issues. But I would say the people I remember some of the early meetings, people who became friends just sat there like they were a caged animal, not wanting to be there. And over time, both teams, I think appreciated what the other brought. More effort to move people between San Jose and San Francisco, where the two offices were. So, it was well thought out. It was, people were aware that the cultural issues were important. But again, it came down to people, right? So you would, identify some of the people who were the thorniest and, show them that their job wasn't going to go away. They were going to be listened to. They were going to have, real positions of authority. So it was a well done integration from that perspective.
Yeah, and that oil and water moment is something we see a lot in the M&A world that we work in when we're trying to help these businesses integrate. And often businesses don't think about the importance of that cultural integration. And something you said, being aware of how you were making people feel and just giving it time. How long was the integration period on something like that? Would it be a couple of years or?
No, I would say it took years to really get a full integration for people to be comfortable. I think that was right when we were starting to launch CS3. So we were trying to figure out how we include products in the then suite. And that actually went really well from a product perspective. And I think when that happened, the people saw that things were going to be okay, the products were going to be integrated, and that there was more of an acceptance around it. And I think there was also, an acceptance that the two cultures were different.
Yeah.
And the Macromedia team, I knew people through to the end. They still identified that, I was from Macromedia, right? I wasn't one of you. So there was some of that, and I think then, there were some other acquisitions that the company did that were smaller, where, the companies were even more independent and had more of a different identity. But it was seen that it was going to be a long-term process. And I think Donna Morris was the head of HR at the time, and she did a fantastic job in the team. And the whole HR team really was well thought out, well structured, and all of the senior management was sort of aware of the people issues, because that is one of the things that Adobe always had, right? They were regularly rated as one of the top companies to work for. Spent a
Yeah.
lot of time thinking about people and about culture. So it was just sort of infused and expected that, people would be respected and, and listened to and integrated.
So next big pivotal moment is deciding to leave Adobe and set up the prompt. And so going from big to very small.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. I was at Adobe for about 17 years.
Long time, isn't it?
If somebody else told me they are, I would immediately judge them in all kinds of different ways. The thing that made that bearable was I had very different careers throughout. And I think that the last bit when I went to the research lab was going from the main corporation to the research lab was really interesting and worth taking, I think, just a minute on, because I was at a conference down in Monterey, the EG conference, which is like a smaller version of TED. This guy was presenting, and it was like one of the most interesting presentations on tech that I'd ever heard. And then he told me that he worked at Adobe. So I went out, introduced myself, talked to him. We started having lunch like once a month together. And then he had all scientists on his team. And I came in as the one business person, and we set up, a group to look at disruptive technology. And that launched like 8 years of working with computer scientists, many of whom increasingly were working on AI in different facets and understanding how they worked. And that gave me a chance to work on what became the Content Authenticity Initiative, because we were looking at how do we deal with identifying fake information, synthetic information, and how do you manage that to build trust around it in a couple different approaches. And I was able to be part of that early team that worked on that. So I did that for about 8 years. COVID hit. My kids were coming out of college. It was time to do something, something different. So I was ready to leave Adobe. We were going through a restructuring. They treated me really well. So that gave me a little bit of runway. And I actually left thinking I was going to go and write a book about disinformation and fake news. And that was going to be the direction that I went in. And as I was digging into that more after I left, I realized that the issue with fake news isn't a technical one, right? It's not us being able to detect, is this image or video real or fake? It's really a critical thinking and the way humans are wired, more it is than a technical issue.
Yeah.
So I was sort of working through that and trying to think through, the technical part is interesting, but, there was a problem with critical thinking and how we were looking at things. And that was right when ChatGPT hit. And at that point, I started just getting calls and people reaching out saying, you're the one person I know in tech. Can you help me understand what's happening here? And then those calls started coming from people who were more senior, either people from places like private equity or other scientists at labs who were saying, you seem to know how people are using this. Help us figure it out. And then that kind of clicked in and said, there's an opportunity here to help people bridge that gap between like where they are today and at least understanding what's happening with AI. And not necessarily from a technical standpoint, because it became clear that the technology was changing super fast and it was going to move in different directions, and nobody really knew what was going to happen with that. But the challenge I was seeing was, how does the average person who's not a technologist understand and adapt to this thing that's a threat to their identity, to what they're doing, may take their job, may take their kids' jobs. So how do you play in this world to help people kind of wrap their head around what's happening and start using AI, in a responsible way? So it was at that point that I said, that's where I want to pivot to and go and focus on kind of that human side of AI adoption. And so then that went from that to sort of making things more structured, setting up a company, the prompt, then looking at sort of where the issues were. And, for me, it was like, it's been the fastest, most aggressive learning curve that I've ever done. It's been a lot of work, face to face with people to try to understand what's working, what's not working, bunch of mistakes along the way, but also a lot of like, with the pace of AI, just, changing things every 3 or 6 months to try to figure out what is it that people need to be thinking of so that they can responsibly start using AI.
And your clients, I mean, what are your clients coming to you? What's the question they ask you?
So most of my clients are non-technical executives or business leaders. And the main question that they're asking is how do I get started with AI? Right. Or
Yeah.
even I know AI is important. I don't know how it's going to affect my business. Or we just rolled out a training, but it doesn't seem to work. What should we be doing next? So there are really two levels. There's one, how do I get my team up and running with AI? And secondarily, how is AI going to affect my business? And on that team level, what we've learned over time is there are 4 or 5 different dimensions that need to happen in parallel for a team to be comfortable implementing AI. You also have a situation where naturally the people who are CEO tend to be more aggressive, more open to change, and sort of probably have greater visibility of what's happening in the industry. And then as you go down through the organization, people have a whole range of reaction to AI from great, like a fascination where they just want to jump in to something which is real fear based out of either they just don't like change or they're worried about their job or they're worried about the environment. So those human factors are really important when you're trying to get a team to adopt AI, right? And as we see today, we have a lot of people who don't know what they can use. They don't know how to use it. They don't understand what a use case is. They treat it like search. So people are at all different levels. So it's really coming in and it has gone from just what is AI to how you assess your team and try to understand where people are so we can talk about how to move them forward. And also, how do you do that across a company? But also, how do you do that as a CEO or as a leadership team?
And you do, I think, a thing called an AI Readiness Audit. Is that about culture or understanding of the technology, or is it something else?
It's a little bit of everything. It's a diagnostic to say what are the things that you need to understand to get started. But I'd say, sort of near and dear to both of our hearts is the culture part, right? So if there is a culture that people feel they're going to be punished or that using AI is a cheat or it's somehow it's a second class citizen, or they're afraid they don't know what they can upload or they're going to be scolded or lose their job because of it, right? That's a terrible environment to expect people to use AI. But if you have one where creativity is celebrated, people are expected, to experiment with it. There's allowance for resilience. The executives are modeling what good AI behavior looks like. So I had one talk where the person who introduced me said, "I hear AI is a thing. I don't use it. I did it once to do a poem about my dog, and it kind of sucked. But Matt will explain AI to you." And I'm like, okay, that's the worst environment to walk into because people know the senior management is skeptical. I also did a session for one of the biggest executive search firms whose CEO thought AI was so important. He led an internal training session on AI. And that afternoon, the usage spiked by 30%. So two really different cultures, right? Another one is just around governance. So a lot of people want to move forward with AI, but they haven't told the teams what they can use or how they can use it. So people start bringing in their own personal AI models on their own devices, which again shows that people want to use it and they're leaning in, but they're using one that's not approved or doesn't have the security guardrails and the systems aren't learning from it. So that's a problem. The other one is just talent, right? Do you actually have the talent on board? Does the company have an AI strategy? So we'll do things like testing. Does the company have a stated AI strategy? And if so, do the employees understand it and do they agree with it? Right? Because as you know, just because you say you have strategy doesn't mean anybody has any idea what it is. Or they do, but know what it is, but they don't agree with it. If people don't understand it, they're either worried about their company's future or they're going to start looking for another job. The same thing holds for the research is that people at the C level, are also more terrified about their job than most, and they're wondering if they should be looking for another company that has a clearer AI strategy. So there are things like that we'll look at, and we'll ask people questions like, explain your AI strategy as if you were explaining it to a new employee, and then you get the verbatims, which we use AI to analyze, that give you a sense of what people are saying that they think the AI strategy is, and when you present that back to an executive, they can't hide from it because this is what your employees are telling you. So there are things like that allow you to say, one, here's a baseline for where you are today. And here's some of the initial things that you can do to get started, because there are really two parts of AI. One is those things for broad-based AI usage across a company, which I think is critical. And then there are the deep AI explorations that are more like a traditional, tech project, where you might go in and pick one part of your workflow and go super deep with an AI model and customization. So those are really two different ways that are both important and work together to deploy AI.
I mean, if you're a CEO and you're thinking about, this is important, that there seems to be 1,000 ways you can go. And it's changing every week or every other day. How do you ground the CEO so that, these are the three things you should think about, or this is how you get going? I know we've talked before, and you talk about the CEO's got to use it, but are there other things that you would guide your clients to do in order to start to comprehend how this might affect your productivity or whole system change, or and where do you invest? Because the numbers being banded around for AI investment for some of these big corporations are just astronomical.
Yeah. So there's a lot there in that question.
There was a lot there, wasn't there? Sorry.
But on that first part, people tend to discount it, where, as you know, because you've dug into it.
Yeah.
But I meet a lot of CEOs who are not using the tools and aren't and they'll use it and then they'll get stuck with where they are. But I actually, if I'm talking to somebody senior, they're like, oh, I have somebody on my team that does it. I'm like, no. You need to start using it for both personal and professional things, and pushing yourselves to use things like Claude Cowork. And a lot of times that works well. So I'm seeing some reverse mentoring take place, where a busy CEO will bring somebody on, don't have to be young, but somebody who knows AI can help walk them through it, right? It's great if that's somebody internal, because you can have that mentoring go back and forth. But I think when the rest of the company sees that Dave is using AI in interesting ways, they're going to start using it to, one, because you've said it's okay, but they also know that there's an expectation. So in that is even little things like when somebody brings a presentation, not asking, did you do this with AI, but like, how did you use AI to make this better? Did AI verify it? Did it test it? So the expectation that there's going to be responsible AI use. So, it's part of a conversation, and people don't see it as a cheat. So I think that's one part of it. The second thing is just a general like AI training and level set, so that everybody understands how to use a common tool. So you want to have the company have a tool. You want to make sure that it's, a workforce tool, so it has the security, but people know how to use AI, to do basic prompting. And what was prompting a year ago is now moved to context, and it's now moved to sort of a system of mapping out your work. So that's where I'm spending time this quarter with companies, is saying last year it would be, here's some light ways to use it. And I think it's helpful to get people on so they're not freaked out and they know where things are. But the thing where a lot of us is sort of doing this work or spending a lot of time is saying, let's look at what information goes into something, what goes out, and starting to codify what the information, the input is, which is a really interesting process for any of us, particularly creatives. Like, what are those things that you just take in, right? And there's the early one people do is like, make sure you have the tone of your voice or your company. But then you have your company's operating instructions. You have like your manifesto, if you have one. You have, so there are all these things that people just take in on a daily basis that they don't really think about, right? And to have AI work for you, you need to think about what those inputs are, identify those things that you do on a regular basis as outputs. And then the other part of that discussion is, I think the most important one right now, is what are those things that only Matt and Dave can do, right? Those things that you want to retain as human. Because there's a fear once you start mapping things out, and it's true, that once you start mapping and codifying those things, it's easy to replace that person. That's why some people don't want to do it, because, and if you've got a messy structure and nobody knows how Dave does anything, it's really hard to take you out of the process. But when you start mapping all those things out, it looks like replacement. So the important part is for any individuals and leaders to say, let's define those things that make this person unique, which also pushes you, like, in your case, to do those things that only Dave can do based on your industry knowledge, your expertise, and your relationships. And that's really what makes you special, not your ability to crank out a proposal, because over time, 90% of that proposal can be done by AI.
Yeah. And what do you think is the relationship between use of AI in business and use of AI in life? And, before I came on this call, I got a splinter. I noticed I got a splinter in the ball of my foot. And so I asked Claude, what is the best way to take that out? Because the skin's growing around it. It came back with a really clear, this is what you do and this is what you don't do. And I just use it 20 times a day in life now. And I bet I use it more in life than I do in business.
Yeah. So I'm so geeky on that. That story gave me goosebumps, because because it bothers me when I hear a CEO say, "Oh, I use it all the time at work, but I don't use it at home." Well, that tells me you don't really get it,
Yeah.
right? So whether you're planning a dinner for 7 people and one's a vegan and one is gluten free, like what can I make? Or like your story, and I had a similar thing, or my plant's sick. So if you understand AI, you're sort of going to integrate it responsibly to everything that you do, which is really different from having AI take over those things, right? Because you don't want to delegate to AI.
Yeah.
And there's a whole discussion, there's a whole active discussion, which people spend too much time on around like how does AI assist and augment versus replace? So I think that whole thing of, hey, I'm trying to do this, or, even playful things, right? So as we've talked about, like that creativity and playfulness with AI is really interesting. So the other day, I got a voicemail from my fiance who was tired. It was rambling, and she was talking how she hadn't slept and her Aura Ring didn't track it. It was a very funny voicemail. Siri destroyed the voicemail in its transcription. So I had Suno make it into a song. Now, that doesn't really have any work like relevance, except that it does make you think about, if I can do this on the home front, then here's a problem or something that came up at work, or I have a difficult conversation at work. How might I think about this? Right. So I think there's a lot of crossover, because what the most important thing with AI as a user, not a technologist, is that creativity. Can I think through what I'm trying to do? Right? What's that next step? And the stakes are usually a lot lower on your personal life than in your work life. So I think that comfort with using it, like I was out sailing the other day in the San Francisco Bay. So I took the weather forecast, I took the tide chart, and I said, write a paragraph for the people who are coming out who aren't sailors to explain what the day in the bay is going to look like. I'm like, it worked perfect, right?
Oh, yeah.
You can do this. That's the same kind of thing for business, for briefing. And I think that also allows you in the business side, not just to replace the things we would have done before, but to think about things that never would have been possible before. So an example with that is I did some work with an onboarding guide for new employees, right? In the past, you've got a standard onboarding guide that you give to everybody who comes in. But with AI, if I know that Dave is coming in from a media background in the UK and he's coming into work in, in this environment in this country, and he's this old and he's got a wife that needs to like find stuff to do and this and that. So you can do an onboarding guide, right? Absolutely customized to somebody that you never would have had the time or resources to do before. But if you set up a quick model for those inputs, and you can do this. So that's where I think when people talk about like, what are we going to do with the extra time? There are things that we'll be able to do to delight customers and employees and just build things out that are around above productivity and efficiency. And I would also just say one of the cautions I have for CEOs is, if you talk about AI as increasing only productivity and efficiency, people are going to think their jobs are going to be at risk, and it's just going to compress the things that they do. So I think a way to look at it is for KPIs. Let's make sure one of the KPIs is around, how do we get people trained up so they have a sense of agency and they understand how to use AI, which hopefully people will stay at the company. But if they choose to leave, or if other factors happen out of our control, they're at least trained up and ready for what's going forward. So I think the distinction is making sure you position AI is enabling the workforce and focused on people, not just on efficiency that you need to report back to your private equity owner. So that balance, I think, can help people and individuals wrap their head around how to engage with AI in a way that can make their job life more enjoyable rather than a threat.
No, because in my head, it sort of makes you a better human. It's giving you access to a world of thinking, a world of knowledge. It's just all there. And so, I say to my team, use this technology and embrace this technology and use it to think through how you can make yourself a more skilled human being, a better human being even. And I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing to do, but, I want to encourage people to play with this stuff.
So one, play I think is great, right? Because that's how we learn, is by playing and experimentation. Like, and the thing I'll do with a recording like this, or a presentation I do, or a meeting, to go in and say, not just give me my action items, but how could I have done better in this meeting? This is my role. This is what I am. Tell me what I did well. Tell me what I could improve. And you also have to say, please tell me the truth. I can handle the truth, or else it'll be sycophantic and tell you what a great job. But you can also dial that down there. But I think that type of thing for saying, like, how did I do? How could I look at this differently? How could I improve what I'm doing? This is my age. This is what I'm trying to do. The other type of thing, which is actually really interesting too, is I've had to do not just a post-mortem on things, but I've asked it to do a pre-mortem. So we have this conference coming up. This is the agenda. Here's all the stuff. Give me the pre-mortem, which is identifying those things that could have gone wrong before they've happened. And it gives you a checklist. And it's actually, most of those things, if you're experienced, you would know. But if you're getting into something new, you might not. But it's, it's a really good way to kind of say, oh, have you thought about these things?
Yeah, and you always forget something, don't you, when you're doing that sort of prep work. Now, I've just looked at the time because I've lost total track of time on this one, and I'm going to bring it to a close. And when we sort of end these podcasts, we usually talk about a fun fact. I'm going to put you on the spot and get you to talk about the funnest thing you've ever done with AI. I have no idea what you're going to talk about, but I'd love to know. Within the boundaries of the law.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's a fun story. It's the thing that kind of really convinced me that there was something here. So my fiance, who I mentioned earlier, is an acupuncturist. She invited me after she was doing an acupuncture training with a friend in Oakland to come join them for a drink at a bar in Oakland. And I was in an Uber knowing that this evening could take a long twist. And I was on ChatGPT early version about 2.5 years ago. And I said, create a cocktail sort of in the vein of Chinese medicine. And it came up with a cocktail. I said, create an image. And it did that. And I said, create a description in the style of the J. Peterman catalog. And it did that. And then it was like a 45-minute taxi ride. And on the way over, I had to do different types of cocktails. And I'm like, I've got the outline of a book here. So I said, create a book around cocktails made by AI for Chinese medicine in the style of J. Peterman catalog. And by the time I got there, I had this outline for a book. The next day was coming up on Valentine's. So I created this book. And somebody encouraged me to send it into Hard Fork, the podcast of the New York Times. And that led one thing to another to that image, the little cheesy cocktail thing I made 3 years ago where the images generations were terrible, getting on the front page, the digital version of the New York Times about a story of like crazy ways that people were using AI. So there were a lot of little things worked in there. But for me, that was just a cool thing. I'm like, you could take these absolutely random things, pull them together, and it comes up with something new and novel, which is also why when people talk about AI is just going to predict the next word in a sentence, I'm like, maybe technically, but that's kind of the same thing we do. But it's like, there's something magical here that if you're like, and that maybe just how my scattered brain works, but if you can pull things in from different areas and like have them come up with something new and interesting and fun. So that was probably the most fun thing that I've done with AI.
I love it. And so, I mean, I hope in this podcast we've encouraged people to go out and play. Who knows what people are going to do now after that story?
Yeah. And I think it's play, and it's also like have it push you, right? And if you have things that you've written before, like what can I learn about myself in this? Right. Which isn't about replacing people, but it's like another lens or another way to look at yourself that can hopefully expand, to your point, who we are as humans and the things that we can do. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about.
And, it's magical to be human, and technology can never replace that.
Yeah. Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt, for coming on Pivot Point.
As always, this was fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pi and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpi.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.